Chapter 1: The Loaf That Built an Empire, When Food Became Currency. Forget everything you think you know about money. Forget gold, silver, or the numbers dancing in your bank account. Because thousands of years ago, an entire mighty empire was built and crumbled by something you eat every single day. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where bread wasn't just food, it was the blood and bone of an empire. Where a single loaf could buy a day's labor, and a jug of beer could be a week's wages. Unbelievable? Yet this extraordinary economic strategy forged one of history's most brilliant civilizations. You're probably picturing colossal pyramids, powerful pharaohs, and endless gold and jewels, right? But here's the kicker. When those monumental pyramids were built, the workers weren't paid in gold. Soldiers didn't receive silver, and officials didn't have a single coin in their hands. So, what truly built this magnificent empire? What powered an ancient Egyptian economy strong enough to span millennia? And what if your food today became your paycheck tomorrow? Believe it or not, it was bread and beer. In a world without coins, paper money, or convenient digital wallets, true value lay in survival. And nothing was more essential than food and drink. For the Egyptians, bread and beer weren't just meals. They were wages, they were taxes paid, they were dowries. They were the currency. Picture this: a worker named Ka, toiling under the scorching sun, dragging massive stones to build a pharaoh's tomb. When the day ends, he doesn't receive a shimmering pouch of cash. Instead, he's handed a few warm loaves of bread and a fresh jug of beer. That was his pay. That was the guarantee that he and his family would survive another day, another week. Why bread and beer? Simple: their intrinsic value and utility. Bread was the primary carbohydrate source, essential energy for labor. Easy to produce, easy to store, perfectly portioned. Beer wasn't just refreshing, it was a crucial source of calories, often safer than water due to fermentation. These properties made bread and beer an incredibly effective currency system for thousands of years. They created an economy based on real value. This sounds alien, right? In our modern world, money is just numbers on a screen or pieces of paper with no intrinsic value. We believe in their worth because the government backs them, and we collectively agree to trust it. But think about the modern monetary revolution. When Bitcoin emerged, it completely challenged traditional notions of currency. Not backed by any government, not tangible. So, what gave it value? The community's trust in the system and its principle of scarcity. In a way, the ancient Egyptians were ahead of their time. They built a system based on a currency whose value didn't come from a king's decree or a central bank. It was the most democratic form of currency because everyone understood the value of a full meal. But how could a vast empire manage everything with just grain and water? How did ancient Egypt pay its workers? What was money in ancient Egypt? How did they track who worked how much, who owed whom, and ensure fairness without computers, spreadsheets, or banking systems? Behind the simplicity of bread and beer lay a system of management complex and astonishingly sophisticated. A system that, in many ways, shaped the financial world we know today. Chapter 2. The Silent Architects, Scribes who built the first banks. Imagine a massive empire running not on coins or cards, but on grain. Tons and tons of grain. Now imagine trying to track all that. Who harvested how much, who received what, who still owed taxes. Welcome to the world of the scribe. The silent architect of the ancient Egyptian economy. These weren't just writers. They were mathematicians, accountants, and auditors, all rolled into one. In a time where 90% of people couldn't write, the scribes wielded immense power. Not through swords or soldiers, but through symbols and scrolls. Every loaf given as wages, every beer jug paid in taxes, every grain delivered to the temple granary, all of it was recorded. On clay tablets, on papyrus scrolls, even carved into temple walls. These weren't just records. They were the backbone of an empire's financial system. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were the earliest banks. They stored grain, issued rations, collected taxes, and managed debts. Picture a granary overseen by priests and scribes. One farmer delivers wheat. A scribe logs it in careful hieroglyphs. Another farmer takes out a ration, another line in the ledger. No coins ever changed hands. The grain was both the deposit and the withdrawal. And just like modern banks, there were audits. If grain went missing, if scrolls didn't match the granaries, there were consequences. In fact, some temples had over 400 scribes, managing thousands of workers and staggering amounts of grain and goods. This was an economy of trust, but also of meticulous control. Scribes had to be exact. A small mistake could mean famine for an entire village. They even had backup systems, duplicate ledgers, sealed scrolls, coded entries. Security and verification, long before the blockchain. And speaking of blockchain, the concept behind it? Immutable, public, decentralized records. Incredibly, ancient Egypt was already doing something similar, 4,000 years ago. Their public records were carved into stone, permanent, undeniable. What was written could not be erased. So next time you visit a museum and see a wall covered in symbols, you might just be looking at the world's first bank statement. Chapter 3. The River's Betrayal, when the Nile refused to give. For thousands of years, the Nile gave life to Egypt. Every summer it flooded, predictably, generously, turning desert into farmland. But what happens when that gift is withheld? What happens when the river that fed an empire stops rising? That's exactly what happened in the reign of Pharaoh Djedkare around 4,300 years ago. The floods failed, not just for a season, but for years. Crops shriveled, granaries emptied, people starved. The very system that ran on abundance began to crack under scarcity. Remember, the economy was built on grain. So when the Nile failed, the entire financial system collapsed. Tax payments dried up. Temples, which acted as banks, ran out of reserves. Wages couldn't be paid. Projects halted. Trade faltered. And just like in modern crises, the poorest were hit first and hardest. Famine spread. Desperation followed. The people began to question the divine order. If Pharaoh was chosen by the gods, why had the gods abandoned them? Whispers of dissent turned into cries of revolt. The bond of trust between ruler and ruled, between gods and grain, began to snap. What followed was one of the first recorded systemic collapses in human history. The old kingdom, which had lasted for centuries, began to unravel. And it all started with a failed flood. One natural event, a few missing meters of water. Enough to bring down an empire built on bread. Chapter 4. The First Strike. The Uprising of the Hungry. The parched earth stretched endlessly, a grim sign that the Nile had failed once more. Granaries stood empty, and the scribes' careful records mocked a vanished prosperity. Hunger gnawed at the people, sparking a dangerous unrest. It was around 1159 BC, during Pharaoh Ramses III's reign, in Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who carved royal tombs. These skilled workers faced starvation as their bread and beer rations dwindled to nothing. Days passed with no pay, weeks with no supplies. The overseers offered silence. The pharaoh's distant authority offered no relief. Tired, hungry, and desperate, the artisans took an unprecedented step. They stopped working. The chisels fell silent. The sacred tombs went unfinished. This wasn't just a labor dispute. It was a fight for survival and dignity. Their protest was simple but powerful. They refused to leave their posts until their basic needs were met. This was likely the world's first recorded labor strike. The authorities were shocked. How dare workers halt the sacred tasks ordained by divine authority? Yet these artisans held skills critical to the empire's legacy. The strike spread, fueled by starvation and injustice. It was more than bread and beer. It was a demand for recognition as human beings, not just cogs in an empire. Eventually, the strike pressured officials to deliver overdue rations. This victory showed the power of unity and the fragile foundation of any system reliant on trust. Chapter 5: The Aftermath and the Scapegoats. When trust collapsed. The strike at Deir el-Medina was just the beginning. The Nile's failure wasn't a temporary setback. It triggered a social and economic crisis that shook Egypt to its core. Granaries remained empty. The bread economy shriveled. Scribes' ledgers recorded debts they couldn't pay. Bread became scarce, its value skyrocketing due to sheer lack. The social order frayed. Trust in Pharaoh, scribes, and the natural cycles dissolved. People began looking for someone to blame. Scribes, once respected as guardians of fairness, faced accusations of corruption, hoarding grain, manipulating records for personal gain. Rumors spread that powerful officials profited while common folk starved. The divine order, Ma'at, seemed broken, mocked by inequality and hunger. Lawlessness grew. Granaries were plundered. Local authorities lost control as survival instincts overpowered social order. This breakdown mirrors modern crises where trust in institutions collapses, scapegoating rises, and social contracts unravel. The Nile's betrayal didn't just empty granaries, it drained the very trust holding the civilization together. Pharaoh and his advisors faced a crisis far beyond food shortages, restoring the vital flow of trust, not just grain. In desperation, some even sought to replace the pharaoh, signaling deep cracks in the empire's foundations.